Well, it's encouraging to hear that some people are looking forward to this sermon. I'd like you to all hold on to that optimism as long as you can. And I'm going to start with an apology. Oh, sorry. Thankfully, she's not here and never listens to the recordings on the website. I'm going to start with what is not an apology. That's what my text says, what is not an apology. Because Heidi says, the worst thing a public speaker can do is begin with an apology. She says to me, if you are sorry for what you're about to say, why should anybody listen to you? So this is not an apology. This is a disclosure. That's my spin. Because this sermon is only part one of two. I have never had this happen before. I just bit off too much. And the ideas that hang together in this one talk take longer than 30 minutes. And so to keep things really interesting, we're ending today with a cliffhanger. And I know that not all of you are going to be here for part two, and that's why I hate this, but anyway, not an apology. So as Andrea said, the premise of this sermon series is, if we're going to take the Bible seriously, as it actually is, then we should be honest about what we find there, and we should have the courage to face it. And our goal is to look at some of those wild and undomesticated passages, the monsters under the bed, the ones that are not nice, the ones that don't end up on inspirational t-shirts and mugs and greeting cards. Imagine waking up every morning to a mug and you've just got all the drowning Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Good morning. God is good. This morning's monster under the bed is actually a multi-headed monster. It's all 10 of the plagues inflicted by God on the Egyptians, most of whom had no power or control in the situation. And then that's followed by the drowning of Pharaoh's entire army in the Red Sea, as Andrea just read to us, as Andrea insisted on reading to us. So I'm going to start by paraphrasing the story of the plagues, and that'll take a fair bit of the time, actually. And then we're going to get all serious and grown up, and we're going to have a talk about ancient literature. We need to have a talk. But first, the story, and I think it's important just to hear it so that when we do talk about it, we've got it in our minds. So Moses has a message for Pharaoh from Yahweh, and Yahweh is the personal name of God that Moses learned at the burning bush. And that message is, as you know, probably, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness, which is kind of true. But this isn't just a little temporary jaunt for a worship time. They ain't coming back. That's not part of the request initially. Anyway, Pharaoh refuses, so as God instructs, Moses strikes the Nile River with his staff. The whole river turns into blood, and Moses warns Pharaoh, the fish in the Nile will die, the river will stink, and you Egyptians won't be able to drink its water. But when Pharaoh's magicians recreate something similar to this water into blood trick, Pharaoh is no longer impressed with Moses. Pharaoh returns to his palace totally unconcerned, but all the normal, sort of commoner Egyptian people have to dig new wells to get fresh water. 1 week later, Moses delivers the same message, but this time with a different threat from God. If you don't let my people go, I'll send a plague of, what would be second on your list? How about frogs? Frogs all over your whole land. The Nile will teem with frogs. They'll come up into your palace and into your bedroom and onto your bed and into the houses of your officials and onto your people and into your ovens and kitchens. It's very specific. Pharaoh does not obey, so the frogs arrive. Pharaoh is more concerned this time than last time, so he calls Moses and says, pray to your God to remove these frogs, and then I'll let your people go. So Moses prays, and Yahweh does what Moses asks, but be careful what you ask for, because those frogs die. They die in the houses, they die in the courtyards, they die in the fields. They're piled into heaps, and the land reeks of them. But still, the problem is fixed, and the moment Pharaoh sees that, he hardens his heart and does not let the Israelites go. Then, without even the courtesy of an interview, the third plague arrives. God tells Moses to instruct Aaron, his brother, to strike the dusty ground with his staff. And then, as God promises, throughout the land of Egypt, the dust will become gnats. And so it is. Throughout Egypt, the dust becomes gnats, and the gnats get all over the people and all over the animals of Egypt. This time, Pharaoh's magicians cannot recreate this trick. They can't turn the dust into gnats. So they tell Pharaoh, no, this one's real. This is the hand of God. But Pharaoh is stubborn and hardens his heart and won't listen. So Moses takes another message from Yahweh to Pharaoh. Here it is, let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you don't let my people go, I will send swarms of flies upon you and your officials, on your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies. Even the ground will be covered with them. But, God says, it'll be different where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, because of the decreased property value. Okay, that's not in there. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, Yahweh, I am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. But Pharaoh isn't moved, so the next day the flies are everywhere, and it's bad. So Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron, and for the first time, Pharaoh is now willing to negotiate. He says, okay, you may offer sacrifices up to your God, but you have to do it here. You have to do it within the land of Egypt, in our borders. No, says Moses, that won't work. The Egyptians find our religious practices detestable, and they will attack us. You have to let us travel 3 days into the wilderness to deliver up our sacrifices. Deal, says Pharaoh. Now pray and get rid of these flies. So Moses prays, and the flies go away. And for Pharaoh, the crisis is over. So he hardens his heart yet again and won't let the people go. So God instructs Moses to go back to Pharaoh, and this time the threat is a plague on all of the Egyptian livestock. Pharaoh is unmoved, the plague breaks out, and all the Egyptian livestock die. But when Pharaoh investigates, he learns that not a single animal belonging to the Israelites has died. Nevertheless, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding, and he won't let them go. So at God's direction, Moses takes some soot from a furnace and throws it up in the air in the presence of Pharaoh, and that soot becomes a fine dust that settles over all of Egypt. And it causes a plague of boils, that soot, an awful skin condition that breaks out on all Egyptian people and even on the remaining Egyptian animals that didn't die from that plague. Pharaoh wants his magicians to recreate this magic trick, or at least try to, but they're too sick with boils, so they can't. And Pharaoh is on the brink of giving in when we are told something that's really quite jarring. We're told that the Lord now hardens Pharaoh's heart so that Pharaoh won't let the Israelites go. Let's just pause for a moment. You're God. You want Pharaoh to let your people go. Pharaoh is now willing to do that. Why would you harden Pharaoh's heart? If you weren't provoked by some of these readings before, you ought to be now. Anyway, let's keep going. God sends another message to Pharaoh. And God says basically this, I am paraphrasing. I've kept my gloves on so far, Pharaoh. But you're so stubborn that the gloves are coming off. Prepare yourself. Tomorrow, you will have the worst hailstorm Egypt has ever seen. You better move your animals and your servants under cover, because anything out in the open will die. Now, some Egyptian officials hear this and they believe, and they move their animals and servants under cover, but some don't. And the hailstorm comes, and it is the most powerful storm Egypt has ever seen, except where the Israelites live. There it does not storm. There it does not hail. And this time Pharaoh seems truly overwhelmed, and he calls Moses and he says, okay, this time I have sinned. Pray to your God to stop this storm, and I'll let your people go. So Moses prays, the storm stops. I'm wondering if you're picking up on a pattern here. And once the crisis is over, Pharaoh hardens his heart. The next time God talks with Moses, though, God says this, I am hardening Pharaoh's heart. I am. I am. So that everyone may see all of these miraculous signs, so that you and your descendants will know that I am God. The I am. So Moses goes to Pharaoh, and by the way, you're welcome to think, about that. So Moses goes to Pharaoh with the next threat, and it is locusts that will eat whatever has survived the hailstorm in the agricultural fields. And this time, with the locusts, Pharaoh's officials start talking back to Pharaoh. That's a dangerous thing to do. And they say, you've got to let the Israelites go. Can't you see that we are ruined? So Pharaoh relents. He calls Moses and he says, okay, you can go. Just tell me who's going. And Moses says, everyone. Men, women, young, old, all of our herds and all of our flocks. We're all going. And Pharaoh says, yeah, I'm going to let you take everyone. Do not joke with me. Only the men can go with you. Now get out of my face. So the locusts arrive, and they do indeed destroy everything. And Pharaoh calls Moses back, and once again Pharaoh says, I have sinned. Pray so the locusts go away. And Moses does, and the locusts go away. And once again we are told, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So now at God's instruction, Moses raises his hands to the sky, and darkness comes over all of Egypt, even in the middle of the day, darkness. And it covers all of Egypt for 3 days, except where the Israelites live. They still get daylight. And then Pharaoh summons Moses and says, all right, you can go. And you can take everyone with you, everyone, men and women, young and old. But leave your herds and leave your flocks. And Moses says, but we have to have animals for sacrificing. We're going to the wilderness to sacrifice to our God. But until we get there, we won't know which animals God wants. So you got to let us take them all. To which Pharaoh replies, get out of my sight, and if I ever see you again, I will have you killed. As you wish, says Moses, quoting the Princess Bride 3,500 years in advance. If that doesn't prove the miraculous nature of the Bible, I don't know what does. As you wish, says Moses, I will take my leave, Pharaoh, but I will take my leave by announcing the 10th and final plague. At midnight, every firstborn son in Egypt will die. But we Israelites will be fine. And when your officials see how things are, they will come to me, and they will bow down to me, and they will beg me to take my people and go. And then I will leave this land. The Bible does tell us explicitly Moses was very angry at this point. And sure enough, at midnight, the horror begins, and there is weeping and wailing all over Egypt, but not where the Israelites live, because the Lord has passed over their houses. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh suddenly forgets that he doesn't want to see Moses again and summons him and says, "Get all your people up and leave now. Take everyone, take all your animals, everything. Just go. And also, please give me a blessing." I just think that's so funny after. Evidently, all the other Egyptians feel the same way, for they keep giving all sorts of presents to the Israelites to hurry them along, silver and gold and clothing. So all the Israelites leave the land of Egypt with their animals, and they are finally free from their captivity, free from their slavery. But there is still that pesky Red Sea in the way. And as the Israelites approach the Red Sea, Pharaoh has a profound realization. Here it is. If you want to insert a picture of a mouth-breathing dolt, this would be the moment. Hey, if a huge portion of my slave labor leaves, then I won't have very much slave labor. That's math. Who says you're never going to use this in life? Math. So once more, the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh takes all of his military chariots and lots of troops and sets out to get the Israelites back. So there are the Israelites, standing with the Red Sea at their backs, watching the approach of the power of the Egyptian military. And then we get to what Andrea insisted on reading to us this morning. God parts the Red Sea, the Israelites march through on dry land, and when the Egyptians come through in pursuit, God sends the waters back, and the entire Egyptian army drowns. And the Israelites see them lying dead on the shore and smile. So there we go. That's the story. It's in our minds, and we can explore it a bit. And first of all, let's just acknowledge it's pretty brutal. I look back, Heidi and I were actually singing to each other this week. I look back on my Sunday school classes, and I'm astonished to remember learning to sing that the Lord has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider fall into the sea. I'm seeing a lot of nods. You learned that too. But we grow up and we wonder, is this okay? God just toying around with Pharaoh like a cat playing with a mouse before eating it? Innocent Egyptians, just trying to get on with their lives. They didn't choose the situation. Having to deal with losing their water supply and their food supply and their animals and their health and their light and their firstborn sons. If we're honest, and I know this is going to sound harsh, these seem more like war crimes than they seem like the Lord triumphing gloriously. So what do we do about this? How can we even begin to think about it? And this is when we need to have our little talk. As you are probably aware, archaeology can sometimes be used to confirm or verify some of the historical accounts in the Bible. It works really well for the New Testament, and it works well for some of the Old Testament going back to about the time of King David. But when we go farther back than that in the Israelite story, things start to get pretty fuzzy. We can no longer as easily, quote unquote, triangulate the biblical stories with histories from other cultures or with the archaeological findings from those places and those times. All to say, when we go way back to the time of the Exodus, to the 10 plagues, and the Israelites all leaving Egypt at once and traveling through the wilderness to the promised land, we have a problem. And the problem is not talked about very much in a lot of churches because this can be very upsetting and it can be very scary for people. This is definitely a monster under the bed. And here is the problem. there are no significant archaeological findings or historical records that can confirm or verify the story of the Exodus as we have it in the Bible. The best we can do right now is there's some comment in one little piece of history from Egypt saying there were some foreigners that lived in a place. It's not very specific. Now, of course, there are always gaps in archaeology and history, so maybe this just fell through, one of those big gaps. Maybe. But there's another huge difficulty, and I mean literally huge, and here it is. The number of Israelites who left Egypt according to the biblical story. The Bible tells us in one place that it was about 600,000 men. That'd be men about age 20 and up. In another couple of places in the Bible, that number, about 600,000, gets refined to 603,550. When we add women and children to that number, we arrive at a total Israelite population of about 2.5 to 3 million. That's a lot of people. At the upper range, that's the population of Greater Vancouver. And that's also really close to the estimated total number of Egyptians that historians calculate lived during the time setting of the Exodus story. So are we really supposed to believe that half of the human beings in one of the world's great empires just up and left, completely humiliating that empire, and nobody noticed? Nobody wrote it down? You can maybe understand Egypt being reluctant to write that down, but Egypt's neighbors would delight in this story. And are we really supposed to believe that a group of people the size of Greater Vancouver walked through the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years and there's no evidence of it? There's no archaeological artifacts left behind? No historical records? It's not like, oh, some people passed through. 3 million. Also, why doesn't the Bible name who the Pharaoh is in this story? All sorts of other kings in the Bible, especially the enemy ones, are named. Why not this one? Would have made verification a whole lot easier. Well, you can see, and perhaps you are feeling, why this is a monster under the bed. Because if you grew up in a church, like I did, committed to a modern, literalistic approach to the Bible, this is all very highly problematic. The Bible can't be lying. So what do we do? Well, we have this talk. We are having our talk. As I've already covered in many past sermons, and I should say, I hope you will take this sermon in the context of all the other sermons I have given, where I hope you have seen a profound respect for the Bible and wanting to get it right, not a desire to just sort of erase the parts I don't like. Hope you get that. If not, well, I'm sorry. Oops, no, I'm sorry. As I've already covered in many past sermons, the Bible is ancient. The literature found in the Bible is ancient literature. And we have seen that ancient literature plays by different rules than modern literature. Problems arise when we try to apply modern rules onto the ancient literature of the Bible. Here's an analogy that I've used before. We confess that Christians have engaged with other culture groups in less than ideal ways, imposing their own imperialistic ideas onto various indigenous cultures, not just here in Canada, but everywhere. We need to expand that confession, though, to include how we sometimes approach the Bible. If we approach the Bible by imposing our own modern ideas on the Bible's indigenous culture, that's imperialism. We aren't truly engaging with the Bible in a respectful way when we do that. We're just remaking the Bible in our own image. We need to approach the Bible on its terms, not ours. We need to enter into the Bible's indigenous culture and see its literature through that ancient framework. So with that in mind, I can offer you this morning one thing to think about when it comes to these plagues and the brutality and the crossing of the Red Sea. And here is that one thought. Storytelling in the ancient world existed on a spectrum, with factual history at one end and mythology at the other. Now, we modern people are pretty good at understanding the factual history end of the storytelling spectrum. And if you grew up in evangelical churches, you're already accustomed to defaulting to factual history when reading the Bible. But sometimes I am suggesting, and not just I'm reading and reporting back to you, sometimes the Bible is closer to the mythology end of the spectrum. And let's get something clear right now. That word is loaded. In the ancient world, mythology does not mean, as Peter Enns once wrote, silly things we made up while on acid. These are the words of a biblical scholar, Peter Enns, unquote. Mythology means stories that set this world in a greater context. Myths back then were deeply important stories that connected heaven and earth, that connected the divine and the human. Ancient mythology, in story form, contains many of the things that we modern people have separated out into fields like that we call religion, sociology, anthropology, ethics, cosmology, political science. It's like we took the full spectrum white light of ancient mythology and we ran it through a prism and we broke it into pieces. So here's a suggestion. The first 7 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua and Judges, can and are, by a lot of scholars, responsibly and respectfully approached as literature that is closer to mythology, properly understood, than it is to what we modern people call history, with all of our facts double-checked and arranged in chronological order. The first 7 books deal with origins. The origin of the world, yes, of course, but actually, especially, the origin of the nation of Israel. Where did we come from? What sets us apart? What are our ideals? And perhaps most importantly, what is the greater story in which we find our place and our purpose? That's what we're finding in these first 7 books. So when we approach these early biblical books, based on what we do know about the ancient Near Eastern world, and because of, not in spite of, because of our respect for the Bible, it is an option, we can let go of our modern imperialistic assumptions about history. And we can just let ourselves go and feel the story. Let ourselves hear the proclamation that is found there, but it's found in story form, not in history form. So in the story of the Exodus, for example, with all those crazy plagues, if it is possible to set aside our factual instincts, what we find is a kind of story that was incredibly common back then. We find a battle of the gods. We find a proclamation that says God is powerful and the Egyptian gods are not. It is a proclamation ultimately of who is real and who is not. But I say if it is possible to set aside our factual instincts because, again, for many of us, because of our upbringing, it can still feel like, wait a minute. And the Bible isn't real? This is all fake? Is the Bible unreliable as a source of truth? So to repeat, our cultural instinct and you could even call it a cultural prejudice, is that modern factuality is the best and only source of truth. Things like modern history and modern science. Facts. By the way, those are good things. But modern science and modern history were not at all part of ancient Israelite culture. They weren't even options. The Israelites had their own cultural instincts. They had their own cultural prejudices. So if we're really going to engage with the literature of their culture, we have to make the effort to jettison our own cultural prejudices, at least temporarily, and enter into their world. So let's try that briefly for this morning's disturbing story. I want you to rethink all that we just heard, that story that I told you, but this time through a mythological lens. And I want to start with a little scene from before the plagues, when Moses and Aaron threw down their staffs in the presence of Moses, and the staffs hit the ground and turned into snakes. And then Pharaoh's magicians do that too, to show that it's not really a big deal, but Moses and Aaron's snakes eat the other snakes. That's mythology. And then all of these plagues, a river turned into blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock plagues, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, the plague of the firstborn. How do these come about? In mythological ways, with a magic staff. You hit the dusty ground, and then all the dust in all of Egypt turns into gnats. You throw soot in the air, and it turns into a fine powder that covers all of Egypt and gives everybody boils. And the biggest clue of all, that this may be a mythological battle of the gods, comes from Yahweh's own words near the end of the story, just before the final plague. God says this, "Now I will bring judgment on," and you would think that you would insert the name Pharaoh here, or you would think that you insert the Egyptian people here. But God says, "Now I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am Yahweh." The struggle all along, we hear from God. The struggle has been between Yahweh and all the gods of Egypt. Now, this idea would be easier to take if we were ancient Israelites, because we would already know what hasn't been explained in the text because they didn't have to. For example, in ancient Egypt, Pharaoh was considered to be a god, not a human. So when Yahweh is toying with Pharaoh in the story, what we are seeing is a struggle among the so-called gods. And what do we learn? Yahweh can even control what is in Pharaoh's heart. Some god Pharaoh's turned out to be. And when it comes to the plagues, hear this. The Nile River was worshipped in Egypt as a god. The Nile River was considered to be protected by Egyptian gods. There was an Egyptian goddess of fertility that's always depicted in Egyptian art with the head of a frog. So this picture of all these frogs all over the place is just a real massive takedown. The ancient Egyptian gods of the earth, or of the air, or of livestock, or of healing, they all take direct shots from these plagues that involve dust and flies and sickness. The penultimate plague of darkness is a full-on attack against the Egyptian sun god, Ra. So by the end, when Yahweh says, this is about bringing judgment on all the gods of Egypt, it makes sense. It makes more sense if you're an ancient Israelite, because you already know a lot of things. So if we can let go of a factual history approach to this story, two things can happen. First, there's a chance we can reduce just how offended we are by this story, because at the end of it comes a little line in the middle of the credits that says, "No historical Egyptian people or animals were harmed in the making of this Exodus." Now, we can still be bothered by the brutality in the story, and we probably should be, because it is brutal. But it is, if what I'm suggesting is correct, that's a big if, of course, it's in the form of ancient mythology. And ancient mythology was brutal. That's the way it was done. I have suggested in another sermon that ancient mythology might have been the sci-fi violence of the ancient world. So maybe, just maybe, we can be a little less bothered by the story if we think of it as a mythological battle of the gods. The second thing that can happen if we let go of a factual history approach is that we can be freed up to think about other things, like why this story, complete with all of its over-the-top Marvel movie-type antics, why is this story such an important origin story for the nation of Israel? What are the lessons being communicated to the ancient Israelites? How does this story help prepare the Israelites for the even larger story to come, the story of the Old Testament, of the Israelite nation? We can start to feel the story and think about those questions. And that, I'm afraid, is the cliffhanger ending. I will be finishing and thinking about that in the next sermon. I do want to say this, though. Brief short foreshadowing here. They do this at the end of part 1, right? They give you a little glimpse of what's coming in part 2. Okay, so here it is. This is not the only story in the constellation of origin stories for Israel. This one shows, as Caitlin actually mentioned, the power of Yahweh. But there are other stories that show us the intimate love and willingness to suffer of Yahweh. Someone willing to suffer, who doesn't really have a choice about it, is not as big a deal as someone willing to suffer who has all the power in the world. And so this is something that I'm going to be talking about next week. No, next time I speak, not next week. For now, let us just remember this. We are under no obligation to like everything we find in the Bible. It is not all there to be enjoyed or even imitated. Some passages are valuable precisely because they disturb us, and they provoke us, and they push us to face hard questions. They push us to think more deeply about God, about the world, about the Bible, about what it means to be human. So instead, let us have courage. And I'm going to quote B.B. Warfield, a highly influential biblical scholar who died about 100 years ago, who ironically was a big driving force for biblical inerrancy in the evangelical world. But he didn't mean what people later thought he did. He said this: "Let us cultivate an attitude of courage concerning the investigations of our time." He admonished his fellow Christians to be open to truth, to be open to the truths of history, be open to the truths of science, be open to the truths of biblical criticism and analysis. And he said, as children of the light, we must be careful to keep ourselves open to every ray of light. So I'm not sorry about the cliffhanger. But the idea is that I hope that we will be open to every ray of light that we can glean from how this story fits in with the other origin stories about Israel. So may we be open to every ray of light. Amen.